There is an ancient thought experiment known as the Ship of Theseus. The core question this experiment is trying to answer is how many pieces of a ship or boat can be replaced before it is no longer fundamentally considered to be the same boat. This is, shockingly, a very difficult question to answer, and depending on who you are and what your perspective is, that answer can be wildly different. Do you need to replace half of the parts, half plus one, the same part 50 times, a small percentage of the parts every few years for many years in a row, all of the parts? Or do you never consider it to be a new ship regardless of how much has changed? Will it forever remain as the old one? There is no true answer to this question, it's just a thought experiment, but believe it or not, I am going to be relating this back to Dungeons & Dragons. A few weeks ago, I released a video where I talked about stat blocks in D&D and what I feel makes for a good one. The things that can be left out, the things that are used and those that are not, but most importantly, the concept of rulings over rules came up. This led to an interesting discussion on my Discord about just how far you could stretch this logic. Can the range of all attacks just be left up to the DM? Can damage just be improvised on the spot depending on the situation at hand? Can certain status conditions be applied or not based on nothing other than just what makes sense in the moment? If you really want to take it to its logical extreme, do you even need monster stat blocks at all, or a monster manual for that matter, when you can just improvise whatever you want? But this then begs the question, at that point, are you still even playing Dungeons & Dragons anymore? And to be clear, I don't ask this as some kind of gotcha moment, I legitimately don't know the answer to this question, but I think it's probably about time to bring in the good old disclaimer. Everything that I'm going to be talking about in this video is strictly for discussion purposes. This whole thing is just an idea I've been fascinated by over the last few weeks, and I really wanted to talk about. I'm genuinely curious to hear everyone's perspective. I'm not asserting in any way that I'm right about any of this stuff, it's all intended to be an open-ended and thought-provoking discussion about game design. The DM, of course, always has the liberty to do what is best for their table, but this isn't about that. So the central question to ask is how many or what specific D&D rules have to be changed before you would consider it to just not be D&D anymore? Or, to keep with the Ship of Theseus, a new game. I think that this can be a helpful question to think about as it can be used to guide the game's overall design direction moving forward, or even for those looking to create third-party content. Before we can even begin to hazard a guess to this question, I think the first thing we'll need to do is to try and address the almost paradox that are the rules of Dungeons & Dragons. Hey, I'm currently on a quest to hit 10,000 subscribers by the time that the revised D&D Player's Handbook comes out in September. So if you like what I do and want to help me reach that goal, a sub to the channel would be amazing. Shout out as always to my members, Julian in the Champion tier, Jackal3 and Jumpy Sonic Bear in the Hero tier, and Julio, Siren XY, Brain the Borks, Nathan, and D&D Unoptimized in the Warrior tier. Your support really means a lot and I can't thank you all enough. So if you'd like to help me out for as little as $1 per month to get some shoutouts, early access to new videos, and so much more, click on the join button. Thanks. If you've spent any amount of time reading the Player's Handbook or the Dungeon Master's Guide, you will have undoubtedly come across numerous passages where the game is reminding you that the rules are not the most important element of it. Straight from the preface of the Player's Handbook, on page 4 we get the following quote. To play D&D and to play it well, you don't need to read all of the rules, memorize every detail of the game, or master the fine art of rolling funny-looking dice. None of these things have any bearing on what's best about the game. Then in chapter 8 of the DMG we see this quote. Rules enable you and your players to have fun at the table. The rules serve you, not vice versa. And then in chapter 9, as the Dungeon Master you aren't limited by the rules in the Player's Handbook, the guidelines in these rules, or the selection of monsters in the Monster Manual. You can let your imagination run wild. What's interesting to me about all of these passages is that they all go out of their way to explain that the rules are not intended to hamstring the players or the Dungeon Master, but rather that they are there to support and provide context for what is happening and how things are to be resolved in the game. Despite saying that the rules aren't what's important, every one of these quotes still mentions the importance that the rules have in providing a cohesive and functional gaming experience. This is fascinating to me, and again, it isn't intended as a gotcha. These quotes really emphasize what the designers believe the core elements of the game are, which is a solid foundational system that allows players to express their creativity and ideas without necessarily feeling beholden to a rigid set of rules that need to be adhered to at all times. The rules have guidelines, yes, to help a Dungeon Master adjudicate a fair and reasonable call, or to help a player figure something out if it's even possible, or to allow them to come up with something wild and certainly try. This is something that's just so cool and emblematic of what TTRPGs are and are somewhat unique in that respect. Here's the thing though, for as much as the rules are guidelines intended to support the creative and in-the-moment flow of the game, the reality is that they are still rules, and if enough of them or certain ones are changed or removed entirely, you will eventually end up in a situation where you are playing a fundamentally different game, right? To take this concept to its extreme, say you're playing D&D at your table, but over time and years you've changed the rules to suit your play better and what you find more enjoyable about the game. It is possible that you've just ended up in a situation where what you're playing now more closely resembles something like Pathfinder than it does 5e. In that person's situation, are they still playing D&D, or are they playing Pathfinder, or are they playing something else entirely? Now, your instinct may be to say it doesn't matter, and to that I'd say you're right, but this is more about the thought experiment than the results, remember? If we take a step back and think about it, the thing is, to at least some people, it does matter. If you've spent any amount of time reading YouTube or Reddit comments, it's quite literally impossible to not be bludgeoned to death with other people's opinions on game rules, then opinions of those opinions, and everyone telling each other that they're wrong or that they've misinterpreted a rule or whatever. But to each person, they've handled it correctly for their group and their table, and as per the DMG, the rules serve you and not vice versa. But nevertheless, comment sections are plagued with people telling others that they're wrong for liking a certain ruling or preferring a more narrative game, or that X edition is better than Y edition because they said so. The irony of this more soft approach to rules is that, to some degree at least, it has bred this bizarre toxicity that exists because some people feel it's important to judge others for what they find to be fun. This from a game with rules that were designed to be inclusive and adaptive. Let that sink in. Anyway, let's get back to the main point. If we take our hypothetical table with tons of house rules that are smaller in scale, where does that end up? Let's say that they've done away with initiative roles and are just letting the group decide for themselves who goes and when in real time. Is that still D&D? I think most people would say that it probably is. Is it 5e though? It's similar to the side initiative variant rule presented in the DMG, so sure, it's probably close enough. But what if they let bonus action and action spells be cast without restriction other than action economy? What if they use bonus action potions? What if they went more extreme and completely removed spell slots and replaced them with their own custom version of casting? The point that I'm trying to make is that with each of these custom rules, this hypothetical table is getting farther and farther away from what the rules describe in the book. So does that mean it isn't D&D anymore? I think in each of these scenarios and more, the players playing them would say something like, yeah, we play D&D, we just changed the way that spellcasting works, or we've adjusted action economy to make play feel a little bit faster. I don't know that any one of these changes on their own would qualify as no longer playing Dungeons & Dragons, but it does start to feel like it's getting close. One of my first thoughts was that if someone were to remove one of the three pillars of the game, exploration, social interaction, and combat, that surely the game would fundamentally feel different, but to some extent, we actually saw this happen in 2021 with the release of The Wild Beyond the Witchlight. This is an official adventure module that provided alternatives for the characters not engaging in combat at all throughout the entire adventure. It was one of the main selling points that they often repeated. You can play this entire module without killing anything. This definitely stands out to me as it does represent that perhaps the three pillars of the game are not in fact that crucial. Now obviously combat was still an option in the module, so perhaps that's the distinguishing element here. This does raise a very interesting question about the three pillars of the game and how important they are in defining it. If someone were to tell me that when they play D&D, their group never has any combat, that they've removed it from the game entirely to instead focus on storytelling and exploration. So while still agreeing that they are probably playing D&D, I think I'd suggest that there might be better systems that already exist to support that style of play. But then, does that even matter if they just like what D&D has to offer otherwise? I ran a poll recently on my channel asking which pillar of D&D is the most important to you, and one comment in particular stood out where they said that combat needs to be precise and repeatable rules, or else how would you plan for it or run it? How would you have a game? And the response that they got was, I mean, you can have it, it wouldn't be a combat game then though. They proceeded to follow that up by saying that if you remove combat entirely from the game, that they wouldn't consider it to be D&D anymore, and this definitely wasn't just true of this person, it was a consistent trend in that comment section. Now, combat is interesting to me though, as even if you don't remove the pillar entirely, I do think that if it is fundamentally changed by, say, improvising all monsters on the spot or something like that, it does lose the essence of what combat is supposed to be in D&D, which is some pretty defined structure and set of rules that bring consistency and definition to the game. There's a certain amount of tacticalness that makes combat feel like it does in D&D. Now, the thing about that though, is that there is a little bit of an elephant in the room when it comes to combat specifically, and that is theater of the mind. While probably not nearly as popular now as it was in the past, largely due to the proliferation of digital tools that make the game so much easier to play using maps, there are still a subset of players who do use this as their preferred method of play. So while they haven't necessarily dropped combat from the game, it is approached in such a significantly different way with so much more ambiguity, and yet I don't think anyone would consider this to not be D&D. If anything has become clear so far, which I'm not confident that it has, it's that the threshold for change is a very difficult thing to pin down. While there may be a certain number of rules that need to change before the game you're playing is substantially different enough to qualify as a different game, I think the more pertinent element is which rules. For example, if someone just removed classes from the game and instead allowed players to select from features and create their own unique class and kept all other things equal, I think I'd hesitate to still call that D&D. It would feel so dramatically different to me that I'm not sure the experience would amount to the same thing. If the D20 system were entirely swapped out for something like a dice pool system, that also feels like a fundamental enough change for me to want to call it something different. What's cool about this entire approach to the design and what we consider to be consistent and inconsistent with the game that we are playing right now in 2024 is that it raises the question of what exactly is D&D? What are we playing? Like I mentioned earlier, if someone removed all the classes from the game and allowed players to create a completely custom character class whenever they played, I would hesitate to still consider that to be 5e. But if that's just how a hypothetical Dungeons & Dragons 6th edition worked, I don't think I would hesitate at all, and this inconsistency is remarkably consistent throughout the history of the game. Despite it being the most common die rolled now, early editions of D&D didn't use D20s for much of anything, but rather focused on D100s a lot more. Early editions also used a lot more vague and ambiguous wording, whereas 3rd edition definitely didn't. 4th edition basically took everything that the franchise had done over the past 40 years and took it in a completely different direction, and yet it still carried the brand name. If we look back at the poll that I ran about the most important pillar, despite combat being the landslide winner, what was clear from reading most of the comments is that while most people will offer a very clear preference, they often value a good balance of all three pillars and would struggle to see the game as a whole without them all represented. So maybe that's our answer here, as unsatisfying as it might be. Many of the official books published over the last few years saw what felt like meager success, and I think a big part of that is because much of the content either didn't feature an appropriate balance of social interaction, exploration, and combat, or they didn't help to improve them in any meaningful way. Adding stuff for the sake of adding stuff has shown itself to just not be the best approach. The best and most successful content are things that feel intentional and purpose-built and not just like fluff. This is also probably part of why we've seen such a recent shift in the community recently towards a lot of third-party content, even from various creators here on YouTube like the Dungeon Dudes, who have been incredibly successful with their Drakkenheim series, and Bob Worldbuilder's new project Delve, which was funded in 13 minutes. Hashtag not sponsored, but go support that if you haven't already, it looks like such a cool project. For clarity, I have nothing against Wizards of the Coast. I think the people that work there and are creating D&D truly believe in the products that they are making, but it does feel like they are unfortunately being held back by their parent company. I've mentioned before that much of the content that we saw in 2023 felt like it was moving in the right direction, so I do hope that this continues in the future. So if you look back at our original question, how many or what specific D&D rules would have to be changed before you would consider it to just not be D&D anymore, I think the only clear answer is that it depends on who you ask. From where I'm sitting, the most important elements are to ensure that not only are the three pillars present, but that they're also engaging and intentional. Publishing an entire book about ship-to-ship space combat, for example, and not designing custom rules for executing on that doesn't feel intentional. D&D stops feeling like D&D not necessarily when a certain rule is changed, but when its direction loses connection with its intention. This was a very different kind of video, so I do hope that you enjoyed it. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe to help me reach my goal of 10K by September, but otherwise, take care.